First of all, I'd like to thank both of you for being here. Brian, Richard, it's a pleasure to have you. Let's start by discussing self-regulation as a general concept. We know that professions in Canada are regulated under this framework, but what is self-regulation and how does it differ from other modes of regulation in the world?
Well, self-regulation is the regulatory model in which professional organizations are given the power to regulate the conduct of their members. Typically, it has two elements. One is agreement with government or by government that the professional organization should have the status of being self-regulatory, and that entails legislation which provides a legal framework for self-regulation. And secondly, it involves a mandate to act in the public interest. That's an important aspect of the role of a professional organization. And I think, Richard, you have a really brief way of putting what self-regulation amounts to.
Well, I think it's where the regulation itself makes the rules and enforces the rules. And they do this through a social contract. It's like the profession enters into a contract with society that it will regulate the profession in the public interest in return for having that authority and that ability, and in some cases, a monopoly on the use of certain titles and performing certain services.
So who ends up ultimately responsible for the regulation of the profession?
Ultimately, it's the board or council of the college, but the board or council is itself accountable to government and, of course, the courts.
And what does that mean, being accountable to government?
Well, it means that through court action, for example, the conduct of the college, as shown through the actions of the board, can be the subject of court decisions, and also, of course, government can revisit this question of the social contract that Richard referred to.
So what are some other methods that are used throughout the world of regulation of professions?
Well, quite often, government just regulates the professions themselves. And then there are some models where there are some split roles, where a central agency, a government agency, will do certain things like investigate complaints and maybe even make a finding of whether the discipline occurred or not. And then the profession will decide what the penalty is. Another model is where the government makes the rules and they delegate to administrative authority to administer the rules.
Are there advantages that you can see to any of these different methods?
I'd say the advantages, first of all, involve the ability of a profession which knows or ought to know what the standards of practice of the profession, for example, should be, what conduct should be expected of its members, gets to make those rules. Also, of course, as members of the profession, they have that insight that they can pass on, which is invaluable. And thirdly, I think a real advantage is that courts in Canada, because of the long-standing nature of our regulatory model in professional regulation, have shown a lot of respect for the decisions of, for example, discipline committees of professional bodies.
I don't think you can overestimate the importance of a profession knowing what really goes on. That allows the profession to make rules that are practical, that are realistic, that will really do the job. If you have a government bureaucrat making the rules, they might often be completely unrealistic as to what can be achievable and what can't be achievable, what's important, what's not important. And also, when you have members of a profession adjudicating a case, for example, or setting a policy, they can cut through the smokescreen. They can cut through the baloney. And when someone says, I was doing it for this reason, you know, someone who knows nothing about the profession, doesn't have the expertise, might be fooled by that. But you can't fool your peers. And so it allows you to really get at the core of what's important in terms of protecting the public.
Now, I think that's what's happened all of these years in Canada, and I think those are all the philosophies that have been behind self-regulation, and certainly why I think it's been a valued method of regulation. But it seems to me that lately there's been some concern on the part of the public, the press, maybe even the government, that there may be some self-interest involved in this. Have you heard that kind of talk, and where do you think that comes from?
Well, I think it comes from an uninformed public, and I think that as board members of self-regulating professions, really we need board members who take to heart the responsibility of promoting public confidence in professional self-regulation. And without that public confidence, then we might lose the ability to maintain what in the world is fairly unique, and that is the Canadian system of self-regulation. So how do you promote that? I think you promote that through sound decision making and, of course, accountability.
It's true that self-regulation is in the decline in the world. England, Australia, New Zealand are tending to move away from it. Just recently, the lawyers in England have lost the ability to regulate themselves. And I think there's a pattern. I think normally the pattern is that it starts off with a scandal or two, and then it follows up with a loss of credibility with the public, and then ultimately, if the profession can't turn it around and regain that confidence, they then lose the ability to self-regulate.
So one of the important things I'm hearing you say is that accountability and not self-interest. That's one of the difficulties, I think, that the public has in getting their minds around some of this self-regulation, because although all of what both of you have been saying about having the expertise and having all of the knowledge and really holding their own profession accountable, there is also that concern that we all know has been that there's been maybe some decreasing the publicity, trying to not make the profession look bad, trying to act in the self-interest. Is that the kind of thing that you think causes the government to get concerned, to think of doing different methods?
I think the government has to be rightly concerned whenever something occurs that causes right-thinking people to think that self-regulating organizations are acting in professional self-interest as opposed to serving and protecting the public interest. Of course, Richard and I both are advocates for self-regulating professions and the current model, but we have to be vigilant to make sure that professional self-interest doesn't creep in and destroy public confidence.
Sure, and it can be just a perception, but occasionally it is a reality. Occasionally boards act in a way that appears to be, and in reality, if you really look at it, is self-interest, and that cuts through. People see that, and people lose confidence. Sometimes the government steps in with smaller steps by imposing some accountability mechanisms where you have to report to independent agencies. Your decisions can be scrutinized by independent agencies, and sometimes they just stop self-regulation, period.
And sometimes it only takes one of those small incidents to start that ball rolling, doesn't it?
Precisely.
That's exactly what happened in England.
So it's pretty important that we're conscious of doing all of the responsibilities and taking quite a bit of care to make sure that that doesn't happen. It sounds like that is a disadvantage. That would be a loss for professions in Canada.
Absolutely.
And the public too, I think.
Yes, I agree. Thanks.